Shirey, it's been a minute since I've seen you, man. It's been a few weeks. Since the last time you and I talked, the Penguins have been eliminated from the playoffs, and so were the Capitals eliminated from the playoffs, and so were the Maple Leafs, and so were half of the first round of the hockey teams that made the round of 16. We've missed an entire round of hockey, but you've had stuff going on in your life. I started a new job as a high school teacher, so I had to take a couple weeks to get used to dealing with 11th graders.
Everybody makes sure to refer to you as Mr. Provident now.
Mr. P.
Mr. P.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's a whirlwind, but we are back and at 'em. I kind of want to just start off with the big one. All right. There is no chance in my mind, and I don't think in anybody's mind, that Sheldon Keefe is coming back to the Toronto Maple Leafs as their head coach. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
No, it seems... No, like I agree.
Okay,
I don't think there's any chance that
right.
He's their head coach next season.
So, with that in mind, and we both know that that's Kyle Dubas' guy. For those of you who don't know, not only was he the head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs, but he was the head coach of the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, which is where Kyle Dubas got his start as a front office guy, as a general manager. So there is I will say there is a better than 50% chance that Sheldon Keefe finds his way one way or another into the Penguins organization. Would you agree with that statement?
It's certainly shaping up that way. I mean, I know there are other openings around the league as far as head coach is concerned, but like this all seems to be lining up perfectly. Not necessarily saying I think this is perfect, but at least as far as all the connections go with Dubas and Toronto and Keefe, this is lining up perfectly. And for anybody who doesn't know, after Wilkes-Barre was eliminated from the postseason,
their head coach was relieved of his
duties. J.D. Forrest was relieved.
Yep.
As well as Kevin Porter, one of the assistant coaches.
Right.
So
was Todd Reardon on the NHL side, just to get that out of the way.
Yeah, and we'll get to him as well. But this is lining up perfectly to, quote unquote, keep Sullivan on a short leash heading into next season, where you can hire Sheldon Keefe to coach Wilkes-Barre, and when Sullivan is inevitably canned before the new year, Keefe has his next NHL gig.
Now, let's pause the Sheldon Keefe talk, because there are other people in that Toronto Maple Leafs organization that I don't think will be in Toronto next year as well. The biggest name, Mitch Marner. I do not think he's coming back. He didn't speak with the media on locker cleanout day. I don't think he spoke to the media after the game either. I think he was suspiciously missing.
I thought he did speak with the media, because
it was locker cleanout day that he did, and then him and Morgan Riley weren't available after the game against Game 7 against the Bruins.
Yeah, because wasn't there a quote that came out where Marner was like referring to himself as like, we're viewed as gods here, and everybody was freaking out about it.
Maybe Tavares said that, but. Regardless, Mitch Marner's not coming back. Mitch Marner has severely underperformed in the playoffs, especially the Steve Dangle podcast put a stat out on their last episode. In games 5, 6, and 7 over the last however many years, I think it was 7 years that they've been in the playoffs. In 16 games, he has, I think, 8 points. It's not good.
It's not going to cut it for that.
It's not going to cut it for that kind of money. Now, I'm torn on Marner, personally. I think that it's more to do with the environment than it is to do with the player. He grew up in Toronto. He was a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and I just don't think that he's cut out for the type of pressure that comes with that market in the NHL. But do you see a situation where the Penguins, and namely Kyle Dubas, tries to make a run at him, maybe to fill a gap or to get him into the fold in Pittsburgh?
Not to say that I don't think it's impossible to make it happen.
Okay.
Like the Penguins will have, I think, somewhere between 14 to 15 million heading into free agency.
10? 10-5, something like that.
Yeah, it's something along those lines. So obviously, if they were bringing Marner in, they would have to move some salary off the books going back to Toronto because they don't have the.
And I don't think Toronto is really keen on doing that either. From everything I hear, they want that cap space to try to rebuild their roster and get some more depth in there.
Well, and that's exactly why I don't think that we'll end up seeing Marner in Pittsburgh, because while it would be great to add a talent like him to the roster, it's really tough to swallow taking on that kind of cap hit.
There would have to be a third team involved to eat cap.
Oh, no question about it. I even think if there was another team eating cap, though, like the Penguins, I know they don't have a ton of veteran free agents, like Carter's coming off the books, Nedeljkovic is gone, and a couple of depth pieces there. But I really think that they're going to try, or at least they should be trying to use every little bit of that cap space to bolster the edges and the margins of this roster rather than dumping it all into one guy who Marner is a great player. Like, do not get me wrong.
Like, for the record, I would agree with you. I don't think he's the right fit for Pittsburgh. I don't think he's the type of player they should be going after. But back to, I guess, the Maple Leafs and everything, because before we get into Todd Reirden and the Penguins side and what actually happened in reality with the Penguins, I do want to touch base with the idea that the Leafs probably waited a year or two too long to blow this team up. As a matter of fact, Dubas alluded to that last year in his end-of-the-year presser in Toronto and, basically had left the door open to get rid of one or two of those core 4, core 5, depending on how you want to look at it. If you throw Morgan Riley in there, pieces. It sounded like he wanted to move on from them, and it didn't sound like Brendan Shanahan wanted to, and Kyle Dubas found the door. So with Toronto holding on to that core too long, everybody agrees with that. Is Kyle Dubas, in your mind, at risk of doing that in Pittsburgh, or do you think that it's not a core issue in Pittsburgh, it's another issue in Pittsburgh? And I would say in this situation, the core being Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and just for the sake of the money, I'll throw Carlson in there as well.
I don't think so. One, because he had nothing to do with signing Malkin and Letang to the contracts that they got 2 off seasons ago. But secondly, while I'm not going to sit here and say that Evgeny Malkin did not decline this past season, and Chris Letang certainly had a disastrous last month to 2 months of the season.
His ending was tough.
So I'm not going to sit here and say these guys are at the top of the league like they once were, but I also don't think they're the issue, especially when you're looking at what their cap hits are and the relative production they provide to similar cap hits around the league. The Penguins issue, it's no secret, not necessarily diving into the nitty gritty, if the power play was XYZ, they would have made the playoffs. But just in a general sense, the Penguins issue is that their depth has not been good enough, and or their goaltending has been letting them down at the worst possible time. Right. So I don't think it's a great comparison there, and I don't think Dubas is at risk of running it too long, because you also got to consider here, even if he did want to blow it up in a sense and break up the Penguins core, Malkin and Letang both have no trade clauses as well.
Right, and so does Mitch Marner. And so it's kind of up to Mitch Marner whether or not he wants to leave Toronto. And really all 4 of them are in the same boat as well. My other thing with the core in Pittsburgh is the amount of money that's wrapped up in it. So in Toronto, Morgan Riley is the lowest paid of those 5 players, and I think he's making $7 million a year. Marner is making over 10. Tavares is making 11.
11 something.
Right now, Matthews is making 11 something. He's due 13 something. He'll be the highest paid player in the league next year. And then Nylander just signed a big deal for 11 plus. So just in 4 players, if you include Mitch Marner in there, there's $46 million in those 4 players. Add Morgan Riley, and now you're up over 50 in 5 players. The Penguins don't have that problem. When we talked about that a couple months ago, Crosby right now is making 8.7. Letang and Malkin are each making 6.1. And on what the Penguins are paying Carlson is just under 10, or is it 10 exactly?
It's 10.5, I believe.
Oh, is it 10? Okay, yeah. 10.5, yeah. So they don't have that kind of money wrapped up in their 4 players. So while that doesn't negate that everything you said, that Malkin and Letang definitely regressed, especially Letang towards the end of the season, the hit isn't as bad, and I think therefore the need to make a move isn't as pressure filled for the Penguins right now. I think they have more wiggle room to build around that core than the Maple Leafs do.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I think bringing Marner in is just more of like a, right. Oh, that would be awesome to have him.
It'd be cool.
But in reality, I mean, they've got massive questions on the blue line right now. On the left side, you've got Marcus Pettersson, who is still a very solid defenseman, but I don't think he was as great this past season as he was the year before. And you know, in a general sense, guys like Pettersson, I mean, they, as far as their peak is concerned, let me take a step back here, but I think fans tend to think, especially with non-star players, that when a player turns in a really strong season, they're like, okay, this is the player that this guy is now and is going to continue to be. But the reality is that with these middle of the pack kind of guys, or the guys that aren't on both ends of the great or awful spectrum, is that there's some variance there year to year, and whether it's the peak or the valley, I don't think that they last as long. So I'm not saying that Pettersson's going to fall off here, but I also don't know that we can necessarily rely going forward on Pettersson being the guy he was 2 seasons ago. But outside of him on the left side, Ryan Graves was an abject disaster his first season. I do think that there's a pretty good likelihood that he will be a little bit better next year, but that's not saying a whole lot. P.O. Joseph is what he is at this point. He's a okay puck-moving sixth defenseman. Mm-hmm. But, you know, you're stuck with Letang and Carlson, and Jack St. Ivan. He showed well on the third pairing at the end of the season. But that blue line has major questions on the left side. And then you look at the depth. They've got pieces there. They've got Jesse Puljujarvi. They've got Emil Bemstrom, who's a restricted free agent. So they've got pieces there. But there's going to have to be something that shows up that's going to move the needle a little bit, and not just more fodder that, like we saw last season when we were going in. We had the Andreas Janssen, we had Vinny Hinostroza, Radim Zahorna. We had all these guys that were like, one of these guys is going to hit. But as we saw, none of them hit. So I don't think it would be a good plan to just bring in a bunch of more fringe guys and hope that they hit. I really think that they need to go out and utilize that space to bring in, and obviously that's easier said than done. Yeah, go out and get good players who you know are going to help you win. That's harder to do when you're talking about depth players, and especially when you're trying to bring them in through free agency, when you're bidding against other teams. Yep. But they're going to have to utilize this cap space to help them improve on the margins.
All right, so with all that said, let's get into the Penguins then. Let's get into more of what this offseason will look like. Obviously, Todd Reirden's gone. How much of this underachievement do you place on coaching?
I've said it a bunch that obviously everyone wants to be like, oh, this is the 100% problem right here. Like, this is the reason things went awry. But at the end of the day, I think it's a combination of everything. Obviously, it's really tough to sit there and think, oh, Sidney Crosby was part of the problem on the Penguins power play this year. Oh, Erik Karlsson, Evgeny Malkin, they were part of the problem on the power play, because they're future Hall of Famers, but they do bear some responsibility, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, for how poor the power play was. Now, with that being said, it is a coach's responsibility to get the most out of their personnel, regardless of what that personnel is.
They did not get the most out of anything.
And they did not. So, to answer your question, I think Todd Reirden got what he deserved. That might sound a little harsh, but I don't see any...
Not harsh about it.
Well, I know, and a lot of people wanted a scalp, like people... for having a 31st ranked power play in the league with that personnel. You've got to have a scalp
now,
for that.
And I get that at the end of the day, the buck stops with Mike Sullivan. But if you put somebody in charge of the power play, and it's the 31st best power play out of 32.
Yeah, exactly. His name is stamped on it.
Gone.
He bears the responsibility for it. I took a bunch of flack on Twitter the day that they let him go because I was like, well, yes, this needed to happen, especially if Sullivan's going to remain the head coach.
Yep.
But are we going to sit here and pretend that when
That
the coaching staff,
are
we going to sit here and pretend that this bringing in like a David Quinn or maybe Sheldon Keefe is just hired as an assistant under Sullivan on the NHL staff? Are we really going to sit here and pretend that swapping Reardon for one of those guys is going to make this massive change?
Especially when you look, again, not to go back to the Leafs, but look at their power play in the playoffs. They were better off not taking penalties. Or not taking power plays. They would have been better off if they could have said, no, thank you, we'll just stay 5-on-5. So Sheldon Keefe definitely wouldn't be the answer. And I don't think David Quinn would be the answer. I don't know that there is an answer unless it's a full-sale change, but that's not going to happen. So let's look at personnel. We could spend more time on coaching, I guess, when they make those.
Well, the other thing I want to get in there, so like, yes, Reardon needed to go, but it's wild to me how many people seemingly think that when the coaching staff and management was sitting down and discussing that putrid power play, that Mike Sullivan was sitting there in the corner with his hands up going, "Oh, I got all these great ideas on how to fix the power play, but Todd, it's your show, so I'm not gonna overstep my boundary here." Sullivan had every bit as much of a hand in that power play, and the reason I know that is because they would not have let that go on for so long without that happening.
Yep. I agree with that. Now, let's talk about personnel. Okay, but you brought up Jesse Puljujarvi. You brought up Emil Bemstrom. There's some other guys in the system. I think that, this is put up or shut up for someone like a Sam Poulin.
Yep.
What is in the organization right now that can contribute or should contribute next season?
Are we talking on the power play or just in a general sense?
We're talking 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, 2 goalies. What does this lineup look like next season from the inside? We'll get into free agents, maybe trades in a second, but just inside, is somebody like a Owen Pickering ready to go?
No.
Is somebody like a Braden Yeager, thank you. Is he ready? I don't think so yet, but I think he's closer than Pickering. These guys in the AHL, like we just named a couple of them, are they ready to go? Like, who is ready in the system right now that can come up into the NHL, maybe fill a third line role? I don't think any of the guys we named are fourth liners. That's why I didn't really they're not built for that kind of role, but. Yeah,
so I'll start with the guys you named, like Pickering. At this point, I'm not even convinced that he's going to be like an impact NHLer. Obviously, the physical tools and his size are intriguing. Hasn't taken any sort of massive developmental leaps. He does seem like a really strong character guy, and that is obviously something that all sports teams and every sport value. And I think that's going to help him, along with his first-round pedigree, at least eventually get a look in the NHL. But at this point in time, I would not feel confident in asserting that he'll ever become an actual impact player. Very well could become an NHL guy who goes on to have a nice career of 200-plus games or whatever it may be. That's not going to happen next season.
Yeah.
As far as Braden Yeager's concerned, I think Penguins fans are romanticizing how good of a prospect he really is just because he is the best prospect they've had in a very long time.
And he does have a shot.
He has a wicked shot, and he is going to be a good NHL
overtime goal that he scored a couple weeks ago,
nasty.
That thing was a laser.
Yeah, his shot is far and away his best attribute. Yeah. However, I think it's much more likely that he becomes a solid scoring winger in the NHL than a top of the lineup franchise cornerstone piece. Okay. And when you're looking at where he was drafted, that's a reasonable expectation, not some sort of franchise savior. The reason I do have a little bit of, I don't even want to call it hesitation, but the reason I don't think he's ready to make the leap next year either is while he did have a very good season in the WHL, With Moose Jaw, he wasn't their top dog. Jagger Firkus, who was a Kraken draft pick the previous year, was their top dog. Great name. Great hockey name. But he was their top dog this year, who basically everything ran through. And don't get me wrong, he was able to lead the team in points thanks to playing alongside Yeager and what they were able to do together. But then you're also looking at guys like Matthew Savoie, who was drafted the previous year by Buffalo, who was also one of their top dogs. So he hasn't been, even though he's played 4 WHL seasons, he hasn't had the opportunity yet to be the top dog there. And even this past season where he had a great year, he was not the team leader in points or points per game. Not to say that that's a bad thing, but I think that should just put a little caution to the wind.
Needs a little more time in the oven. Just needs to bake a little more.
Thing, he's technically not eligible to play in the AHL next season. His age and birthday is right on the cutoff there, though. Okay. So there is a possibility that they make an exemption for him to play in the AHL next year. But I'm almost more inclined, if I were making the decisions, I would want him to go back to the WHL for one more year, where he is going to be the top dog, and see how he does there. Okay. And then there's a possibility that after that season, he might be able to make the jump to the NHL the following season.
So then, just rapid fire, are there any players in the AHL right now that you see can come up into the NHL next season?
We will definitely next season at some point see Vasily Ponomarev, who was acquired in the
completely forgot
the Jake Gensel trade. He projects as a
third, fourth line center, right?
Third, fourth line guy. I actually think he has some decent qualities. I watched a little bit of his tape. I think he's played 2 NHL games with Carolina already, scored in one of them. He looked okay. It was a little disappointing, though. It was shaping up like he might get a call up to the Penguins at the end of this past season, but he ended up getting hurt after a few games with Wilkes-Barre. So we'll definitely see him at some point next year. I don't want to assert one way or the other whether he makes the team out of camp, because there's a lot of variables in play. And
so, Rook, do you think he would be so like, say he ends up fourth line center? Is that an upgrade for you?
Over like Noel Acciari? Sure.
Noel Acciari, Jeff Carter.
Yes.
Any of the guys that were just.
I think so. And because you brought that up, I think now would be a good time for me to bring up the fact that the way Mike Sullivan has deployed his bottom 6 and specifically his fourth line over the past several years in an extremely defensive manner, and relying on them for a ton of defensive zone starts and wanting them to take care of the defensive side of the puck first. I think there's a legitimate question there about guys like Ponomarev and Sam Poulin, who are guys that don't project as top 6 guys. How are these kind of guys really going to develop in bottom 6 roles under Sullivan, when even just down the stretch here, we saw guys like Valtteri Puustinen getting benched in the third period so Jeff Carter could go up to the second line and play with Malkin. Yeah. So there's going to have to be some sort of adjustment there from Sullivan and his staff on how they look at their bottom 6, what they want out of those guys, and the way they want them playing.
Now, the last question I have for you is, do you see more merit in the Penguins trying to rebuild? Because this is what's going to happen. It's going to be a rebuild on the fly. As much as I don't think any of us like that idea, because it very seldom, if ever, works, is it more probable, and is it better for them to do that through free agency or via trade? Looking at the positives and negatives of both, free agency, you're just giving up money. But you're going to overpay for a free agent, because as you said earlier in the show, and as everybody that watches sports knows, you're bidding on these players with other teams. And so a person that might in a normal world command $4 million may command $5 million because of the market.
Or you end up giving an 8-team no trade clause to Noel Acciari.
Exactly. So there's that negative of free agency. And then on the flip side, trades, you may not have to worry about paying as much out of pocket money-wise, salary cap-wise, but you're going to give up assets. You're going to give up a first-round pick or a second-round pick, or maybe one of these guys that we were just talking about, these younger players. For this team where it's at right now, how do they go forward rebuilding this roster and filling these holes? Because there are holes.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely going to have to dabble in free agency to some degree, as much as that
And this
might.
isn't a very strong free agent market this year either.
The free agent class
not
isn't great, especially if you throw the possibility of Gensel returning. Like, he's far and away the best player of this class.
And he's going to command a lot of money, and I don't think he's going to – now that we've seen him on another team, and I think everyone in Pittsburgh knew he wasn't a product of Crosby, but I do think there was a lot of questions outside of Pittsburgh about that. He has proven that he's his own guy. Now, he's playing with good players in Carolina, no doubt. But you don't become the all-time leader in points from the trade deadline to the end of the season by piggybacking off of other players. He's going to command $9-10 million, I think.
Yeah, and even if he doesn't, like, from everything we've learned about everything that went down between him and the Penguins and Dubas, it doesn't even seem like Dubas necessarily wants him back. Not that he wouldn't want Gensel on the team, but he thinks that Gensel's going to command more than it would be worth for the Penguins. So looking
Which
beyond...
is probably true.
Probably. And then that gets into the whole, are you trying to ramp up for one more season and then what happens beyond that be damned? Or are you actually trying to continue to toe the line? I don't want to get into that conversation. But beyond Gensel, Steven Stamkos is a pending free agent. I don't see him coming to the Penguins.
And I don't want them to get older either. Look, even if you're ramping up for one more year, getting older is not the way to go. He's injury prone.
Yeah,
it's not what I'm looking for here.
And I know Tampa's kind of at a crossroads right now as well. I'd still be kind of surprised if he doesn't return there. Yeah. But beyond those guys, there's not a ton to like. There's obviously good players who are going to be available. I think obviously the Penguins will dabble in free agency a little bit, but I think we're going to see more. I don't necessarily want to say more, but I think we're going to see a similar route to like the Riley Smith trade that we saw last offseason, where cap-strapped teams are looking to shed salary, not necessarily because this player isn't good anymore, but because they just have other priorities.
Speaking of, is he a Penguin next year?
Who?
Riley Smith.
That's a good question. I
didn't think he'd be a Penguin at the deadline.
Yeah, I
thought he was going to go.
I don't know.
And for me, he showed so much promise with Malkin at the beginning of the season last year, and he showed flashes throughout the season. But the Penguins are not in a situation where they can use flashes. They need solid, this is what we can depend from you production, or we can depend on from you, and he didn't do that. He was very up and down.
Well, and beyond that, I completely agree with you. But beyond that, they need some, this is going to sound stupid to a lot of people, but they need some dogs. They need some guys with some juice. And for long stretches of last season, Riley Smith just played with absolutely no juice. So to answer your question, I legitimately don't know. I kind of have a feeling that one of Raquel and Smith will be moved this offseason, not both of them, but I just kind of have a feeling that one or the other will be gone.
I kind of would hope both of them personally.
I'm not as down on Raquel as others. I understand why people are.
You're going to hate me for this. Maybe we can end on this argument because I know it's going to be an argument.
All right. All right. Well, before you bring it up, then, I just want to get back to answering your original question. So beyond free agency, I do think we'll see a trade or two bringing in a guy from a cap-strapped team. But also there are some younger players around the league who had high draft pedigree that have kind of fallen out of favor with their current team. A couple guys that immediately come to mind are Oliver Wahlstrom with the Islanders, Arthur Kaliev out with the Kings. There are going to be some of those guys available. And I think we'll see a few of them moved. Even someone who isn't quite as young, but like a Nick Ehlers up in Winnipeg's the Athletics reporting that he's going to get moved. So I think there will be an opportunity to bring in a player in that fashion. That's what I got. Yeah. So let's go ahead and argue now.
So I can't help watch the playoffs this year.
Okay.
And I look at the Rangers, right? And then I look at the Florida Panthers, the Boston Bruins, look at the Toronto Maple Leafs, look at the Vegas Golden Knights and the Dallas Stars, and I look at all of these teams that I've just rattled off. and the way they are built. And while not all of them, and honestly very few of them, have what I would consider a like heavyweight fighter guy that's going to go out and just like beat people up, not a single one of those teams are soft. They're pesky. They play to piss you off, and they have guys that will mix it up. Give me one player on the Penguins outside of Evgeny Malkin or Chris Letang that will mix it up.
Michael Bunting.
Okay, that's it. Michael Bunting. The Penguins need to change their identity to match what the NHL is doing right now. Just like the NHL changed its identity when the Penguins won back-to-back and the Blackhawks were winning, and speed and just skill all over the place was just coming at you in waves. The NHL is shifting, and even though scoring is up, the NHL is shifting to where you don't necessarily need fighters, but you need to be a nasty hockey team to survive the playoffs now. It's one thing to get in. It's another thing to survive them. And right now, the way the Penguins are currently constructed, they can't survive. I can't see them surviving Boston. Can't see them surviving Toronto. I can't see them surviving Florida. And I'm lumping Toronto in there because Toronto was the aggressors against Boston. Bertuzzi was getting nasty. Domi was getting nasty. Reeves was getting nasty. Even Morgan Riley was getting, mixing it up with players. They had a different identity this season than they normally do, and you could tell it was, at times they were the aggressors with Boston. So my concern with the Penguins is they're so far away from that even if they got into the playoffs, they're just going to get beat up. They're going to get pushed around and they're going to get beat up. And if you don't believe me, look at their record against the teams that I just rattled off. Look at the good playoff teams and look at the Penguins' record against them. There was one game against the Florida Panthers where I thought they showed some grit, and I thought that was going to be a turnaround.
We argued about it months ago.
Right. And then the next time they played the Florida Panthers, they got their lunch fed to them. I don't think that they're in a position to actually be contenders. And I don't know the road that they can take to get to that point. So I know this isn't going to happen, but I do kind of wish they'd just flip the switch and go into full rebuild mode.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing that I brought up a little bit ago. Are they going to try and kick the can down the road? Are they going to try and be competitive for one more year just because Crosby's chugging along the way he is? Or are they going to keep towing the line? Obviously, all points or all signs are indicating that they're at least going to try and be competitive.
They're going to try to.
So I'm with you, man. Like, I probably don't believe it to as great of a degree as you do, but that goes back to what I was saying about Smith a minute ago. They need some guys who play with some juice.
Now, I think Smith has the ability to do that. That's what frustrates me about him. I think that him and Bunting could be guys that are gritty, pesky, nasty. They don't have to be fighters. I'm not talking about enforcers.
No, not at all. But there's definitely an element of bringing that, and obviously I don't know how many times I can say obviously in this podcast. It's been a minute if you can't tell, but it's not realistic for Michael Bunting to bring that like kind of ratty attitude every single game, night in and night out over 82 games. But it's consistent enough where you can verifiably attribute those qualities to him.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think the Penguins need to go out and goon it up or go get guys like Ryan Reeves, but they need some guys who are going to verifiably bring them some energy and bring some juice on a relatively consistent basis.
Because we're wrapping up, we're getting to time. I would like to see a world where when Sam Bennett, they're playing the Panthers, and Matthew Tkachuk and Sam Bennett are messing around with Crosby, it's not Chris Letang coming to his defense. I'd love to see a world where we have a guy, a third liner or something that will get back at them, that will take, I hate to say it, but almost take a cheap shot back at them. Get nasty, don't give a damn, play that style of hockey when it's needed. And you see more and more teams building themselves like that right now. And look, you have that top end elite talent that is happening in the NHL, But there is, after that top-end elite talent, a lot of these teams, I mean, look, Vegas last season when they won the Stanley Cup, they had one player under 6 foot, and he won the Conn Smythe. Jonathan Marchessault. So they were built for the long term to take a beating and give a beating. And I think that's where the NHL is right now. I don't necessarily like it. I like seeing the skill more. I like letting that be on display more. But that's where we're at. I mean, Matt Rempe has become a cult hero for a reason. And that's where the NHL is.
Yeah, I think anybody who disagrees would be kidding themselves that, like, whether you like it or not, toughness is very, very important in today's NHL. And when I speak of toughness, I'm not talking about Ryan Reeves dropping the gloves and beating the crap out of somebody, but toughness in the fact that you're willing to stick up for your teammates and the stars on your team. Toughness in the sense that you're not going to shy away from, Tkachuk and Bennett going after Crosby. You're not going to shy away and wilt when you give up a goal after you just scored one kind of thing, as we saw the Penguins absolutely do throughout this entire past season as well as the season prior. So when I'm talking toughness, I'm talking guys who, and again, like Michael Bunting was a great addition. He's not some great player, but guys who bring those qualities and those characteristics, that's the kind of toughness that I'm referencing here. And the Penguins absolutely need more of it. And I don't know, as you mentioned a little bit ago, I don't know that there's a legitimate path to getting enough of it to legitimately say that, the Penguins are back.
I agree with you 100%. It is going to be a wild offseason. I could see this going so many different ways. And I mean that on the coaching staff. I mean that in the front office, because I'm hearing whispers of, even Dubas becoming the GM this year to keep a seat warm for Brandon Pridham. There are so many things that could happen this season. That's like a really off the wall thing, but we don't know. There's so much this offseason. And I think that the way the playoffs end up shaking out will probably have an impact on that as well, because who performs and who doesn't perform is going to determine who goes and who stays. We've just said it with Mitch Marner. He's probably, because he didn't perform, he's probably gone. And Toronto's going to look different. And if Toronto looks different, that means other teams that they deal with are going to look different. The Penguins are, look, man, maybe 8 or 9 of the maybe 8 forwards that are there maybe are still around. But I think 4 or 5 forwards are going to be different. I think 3 defensemen we could see a half of the defensive core be different. It's going to be a different hockey team next year. So I don't know. I'm just buckled up, and we'll see where the ride takes us.
Yeah, the one thing the Penguins have going for them, and I've been on record as saying this for months now, the one thing they have going for them heading into next season is that I don't think at least the middle of the pack in the Eastern Conference is all that great. So if they are prudent in the moves that they make this offseason, whether it be through trades or free agency or both, I think there is a path to them to at least getting back into the playoffs, although I'm not necessarily saying I think that will happen.
No, but let's even look at this year. If their power play was middle of the pack, they're a playoff team.
Right. I mean, the Capitals got into the postseason as the second wild card with a minus 37 goal differential.
So there's a path to the playoffs for them.
Yes. From
there, it's kind of it is what it is, but there's a path to the playoffs for sure. I mean, the way they were constructed this year, they weren't too far off.
Right.
So we'll see what happens, man. Anything else for listeners?
No, that's it. I agree with you. I think it's going to be a fascinating offseason. I think we're going to learn a lot about Dubas, because now this is a full offseason for him to build out his hockey ops staff.
Yep.
I think we're going to learn a lot about FSG as well. Maybe not during the offseason, but if we get into next season, and same old Penguins, especially with what we think is going to be a little bit of a different looking roster. Are they going to bite the bullet on Mike Sullivan before the new year? Are they going to keep kicking that can down the road? So I think it will be entertaining, and I think we're going to learn a lot about Dubas and FSG and how they're going to continue to run this team.
Yeah. Well, don't forget to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. You get the alerts on YouTube. We never say that.
Hit the bell.
Hit the bell. For Danny Shirey, I'm Eddie Provident. Thanks for watching and listening. We will see you next time on the Breakdowns and Breakaways podcast.